In Silver Ridge, Nebraska, some outlaws thought stealing was their birthright. They thought their guns made them untouchable. But Samantha Jackson knew the truth. The most dangerous poison doesn't come from a rattlesnake's fangs. It comes in a crystal decanter poured by a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. 4 men rode in demanding free brandy. 4 bodies rode out at dawn. This is how a widow became an executioner.
Hello, I wish you a wonderful, amazing 2026. If you enjoy old Western stories, then you're in the right place. Tell me where you're watching from. Comment and share these videos with friends and families. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel too. My team and I have something wonderful and free for you once we hit the 1,000 subscriber mark. We will share it in the community. You know, we go to great lengths to craft these stories, so your support means a lot to us. Join us and be a part of what we are building.
Before we dive into Samantha's story, let's talk about why vigilante justice was so common in the Old West. In the 1870s and 1880s, the American frontier was massive, but law enforcement was incredibly scarce. A single sheriff might be responsible for territory covering hundreds of square miles. Federal marshals were even rarer, sometimes overseeing entire states with just a handful of deputies. This created what historians call the justice gap. Criminals knew they could commit crimes in one territory and simply ride to another before lawmen even heard about it. Corrupt officials made it worse. Sheriffs, judges, and even marshals were often bribed by wealthy ranchers, railroad barons, or outlaw gangs themselves. The result, between 1850 and 1900, over 200 vigilante committees operated across the Western territories. Some, like the Montana vigilantes, executed more than 20 men in a single month. Citizens took justice into their own hands because waiting for the law often meant waiting forever. Women were rarely the executioners in these stories, but they suffered the most from frontier violence, losing husbands, sons, and brothers to outlaws who faced no consequences. Now, let's see what happened when one widow decided she'd had enough.
Some outlaws thought their guns made them untouchable. But in Silver Ridge, Nebraska, Samantha Jackson proved the deadliest weapon isn't forged in steel, it's poured from a crystal decanter. 4 men rode in demanding free brandy. 4 bodies rode out at dawn. This is how a widow became an executioner. The summer heat of 1879 shimmered over Silver Ridge, Nebraska, a railroad town that had seen too much violence and too little justice. The Union Pacific Line cut through the heart of town, bringing prosperity and predators in equal measure. Behind the polished mahogany bar of the Golden Ace Saloon stood Samantha Jackson, a widow of 35 years who'd learned that survival on the frontier required more than faith and fortitude. Her establishment had earned a peculiar reputation along the Platte River, one whispered about in neighboring settlements but never quite proven. Men who came looking for trouble at the Golden Ace had a strange habit of being found dead by sunrise, their bodies discovered on trails outside town, their deaths attributed to bad whiskey or failing hearts. The pattern was undeniable to those paying attention, but in a territory where wanted criminals outnumbered lawmen 20 to 1, few questioned the convenient departures of violent men. That July evening, 4 riders approached through the dust. The Dalton brothers, wanted in 3 states for train robbery and murder, their reputations stained with blood and theft. Wade, Carl, Tommy, and Frank Dalton had heard about the Golden Ace, about the pretty widow who ran it alone, and they figured her for easy pickings, another establishment to intimidate, another woman to terrorize. What they didn't know was that Samantha had been waiting for men exactly like them. More specifically, she'd been waiting for them.
3 years of patient hunting, of building her reputation and refining her craft, all leading to this moment. Her husband Roland's murder had taught her a valuable lesson. The law was too slow, too corrupt, and too compromised to deliver justice, so she'd learned to deliver it herself, one carefully prepared bottle at a time. As the Dalton brothers pushed through the saloon doors, their spurs jingling against the worn floorboards, Samantha reached beneath the bar for a special bottle, one she kept for occasions precisely like this. The label read simply, Reserve 1876. Hold on, if this story has you hooked, hit like. Not subscribed yet? Fix that now. Drop your state in the comments. These stories ride far. Stay with me. The next moment hits hard.
Death doesn't always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes it arrives in a crystal glass, poured by steady hands that have learned to hide trembling rage behind practiced composure. Wade Dalton stood 6'2", with a scar across his knuckles from pistol whipping a bank clerk in Omaha, a souvenir he displayed proudly. His brothers flanked him like wolves hunting in a pack. Carl, the enforcer, with cold gray eyes and the fastest draw in the gang. Tommy, the youngest at 23, nervous energy barely contained beneath false bravado. Frank, the strategist, always watching, always calculating the angles. The golden ace fell silent as they entered. The piano player's fingers froze mid-song. Card games paused, hands hovering over chips and worn bills. Even the smoke seemed to hang motionless in the lamplight, as if the air itself recognized predators had entered. Samantha continued wiping down the bar, her movements unhurried, deliberate. She'd learned that showing fear was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. It only made them circle closer, bite harder. Wade approached with the swagger of a man who'd never faced real consequences, his boots heavy against the floorboards. His brothers spread out with practiced efficiency, covering the exits, blocking escape routes they'd memorized from a dozen similar establishments. "We'll be needing some hospitality, ma'am," Wade announced, his voice carrying the false courtesy that dangerous men often employed. "Heard you serve the finest brandy this side of the Platte River." Samantha met his gaze without flinching. She'd looked into the eyes of killers before. Her late husband, Roland, had been a railroad detective, and she'd learned to read violence in a man's stance, his breathing, the way his fingers twitched near his weapon. These four were predators, and they'd come to her establishment expecting easy prey. "I serve paying customers," Samantha replied evenly, setting down her cloth. "Brandy's 3 bits a glass, $6 a bottle." Carl laughed, a sound like gravel scraping glass. "Now that ain't very neighborly. See, we've been riding hard for 4 days. We're powerful thirsty, and our pockets are a mite light. We figured a respectable establishment like yours might extend some credit to weary travelers." The subtext was clear as Nebraska sky. They had no intention of paying. They'd drink their fill, probably terrorize the customers, maybe rob the till, and ride out leaving destruction in their wake. But the Golden Ace wasn't just another saloon, and Samantha Jackson wasn't just another widow trying to survive.
Samantha's fingers closed around the neck of a distinctive bottle. Unlike the standard brandy that lined her shelves, this one bore a handwritten label, Reserve 1876. The amber liquid inside looked identical to any quality spirit, which was precisely the point. She'd spent 3 years perfecting the recipe, working with Dr. Patrick Sullivan, a railroad physician who'd lost his way to morphine after watching too many men die on operating tables. His knowledge of toxicology was impeccable, his moral compass permanently broken by frontier brutality. The poison was derived from oleander and water hemlock, plants that grew wild along the Platte River bottomlands.
Mixed with a tincture of concentrated alkaloids and properly aged in brandy, it became virtually undetectable. The beauty of her formula was its delayed effect. A man would drink, feel nothing immediately wrong, and continue drinking. The symptoms would begin subtly, slight numbness, dizziness easily attributed to alcohol itself. By the time the real effects took hold, 20 to 30 minutes later, the paralysis would be irreversible and death would appear to be heart failure or stroke. Frontier doctors, overworked and undersupplied, rarely questioned such diagnoses, especially when the deceased were known criminals. 3 years ago, Samantha had been a different woman. She'd believed in the goodness of people, in the protection of law, in justice prevailing over evil. Then Roland Jackson had been ambushed outside North Platte while investigating the Dalton gang's train robberies. Shot in the back, left bleeding on the railroad tracks, his documents stolen, his badge trampled in the dirt. The local sheriff, bought and paid for by railroad baron Vincent Hayes, who fenced the Dalton stolen goods, had conducted no real investigation. No arrests, no justice, just empty condolences and Roland's badge delivered in a pine box alongside his body. Samantha had sold their house in Omaha, bought the Golden Ace with Roland's life insurance, a paltry sum that barely covered the purchase price, and began her transformation from grieving widow to calculating executioner. Her first kill had been accidental, a drunk cowboy she'd overdosed on laudanum while trying to protect her waitress. When he simply stopped breathing and the death was ruled natural causes, Samantha realized the possibility that existed in her hands. Over 3 years, 17 wanted criminals had been eliminated. Tonight, she would finally face Roland's actual killers. The Dalton brothers had no idea they were already dead men. If Samantha's justice grips you, subscribe now. This widow's war is just beginning, and what comes next will leave you breathless.
Samantha placed 4 crystal glasses on the bar with deliberate care. "Well now," she said, her voice carrying throughout the silent saloon, "I suppose I can make an exception. After all, hospitality's a Nebraska tradition." She poured generously, the liquid catching the lamplight as it filled each glass. "Drink up, gentlemen. It's on the house." Wade's scarred face split into a triumphant grin. He'd expected resistance, maybe even violence, and the easy victory made him careless. He reached for his glass, and his brothers followed suit. Samantha noticed Clayton Brooks in the corner, a regular who'd seen this play out before. Their eyes met briefly, and Clayton gave an almost imperceptible nod before returning his attention to his cards. The other patrons, sensing something significant was occurring, remained unnaturally still, like prairie dogs who'd caught the scent of coyotes. "To easy pickings," Wade announced, raising his glass in mock salute before downing it in one swallow. The brandy burned pleasantly, smooth and strong, exactly what he'd expected from a quality establishment. Carl and Tommy followed their brother's lead, emptying their glasses with the enthusiasm of men who believed they'd successfully intimidated a helpless widow. They didn't notice Samantha's slight smile, quickly suppressed, or the way she'd carefully avoided touching the bottle with her bare hands, thin leather gloves protecting her skin. "That's fine brandy, ma'am," Wade announced, sliding his glass forward for a refill. "Real fine indeed." His meaning shifted, voice dropping lower. "You know what? We might just stay the night. You got rooms upstairs?" His implication was clear, and it had nothing to do with lodging. Carl and Frank laughed, already emboldened by free brandy and the absence of resistance. Samantha poured again, her hands steady. 3 years ago, she would have been terrified. 3 years ago, she'd been a different woman. Wade settled in, his initial aggression mellowing into the false camaraderie that alcohol often inspired in violent men. He began talking, as predators always did when they thought themselves safe and superior. "You know, this reminds me of that job outside North Platte." Wade slurred slightly, already on his 3rd glass. Some railroad dick thought he was tough, thought he could track us. He laughed darkly. Fought being the operative word. Shot him right in the back, left him bleeding on the tracks like the pig he was. Samantha's expression remained neutral, but her hand tightened imperceptibly on the bar cloth. That railroad detective had been her husband. Samantha's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady, carefully modulated to sound impressed rather than filled with murderous rage. "Is that so? You boys must have quite a few stories." Carl, smaller than Wade but meaner, with eyes like a weasel, leaned forward conspiratorially. "We got stories that'd curl your hair, lady. You hear about that bank job in Omaha? That was us. Took $18,000 and left 2 tellers bleeding on the marble floor." He said it with pride, as if robbery and murder were accomplishments worth celebrating. Frank added details about the North Platte job, how they'd ambushed the railroad detective, stolen his investigation documents, sold them to Vincent Hayes for $500. They laughed about how the local sheriff had been paid to look the other way, how easy it all had been. Tommy, the youngest, had gone pale. "Wade," he muttered, gripping the bar for support, "I ain't feeling right. This brandy's hittin' hard. My fingers are tingling." "You always were a lightweight," Wade responded dismissively, but Samantha saw him blink slowly, his scarred face showing the first hints of confusion. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but his fingers seemed clumsy, uncoordinated. "What the hell?" he began, then stopped, his words slurring more noticeably now. Samantha stepped back from the bar, creating distance. The clock above the bar read 8:47, 23 minutes since the first drink, right on schedule. Carl tried to stand but stumbled, catching himself on a chair. "What kind of brandy is this?" he demanded, voice thick. Samantha's voice cut through the room like a blade. "My name was Samantha Garrett before I married Roland Jackson." Wade's eyes widened with the first flash of recognition and terror. "What did you say?" "The railroad detective you shot outside North Platte 3 years ago. You left him bleeding on the tracks." Her voice was ice and fire. "I'm his widow." The name hit Wade like a physical blow. "You're his—" "Yes, and you just confessed to his murder while drinking poison." She paused, watching comprehension flood his features. "Oleander and water hemlock, aged in brandy for 6 months. There is no antidote." Tommy collapsed first, crashing to his knees, gasping that he couldn't feel his legs. "Please," he whispered, "I don't want to die." "Then you shouldn't have ridden with murderers."
Carl drew his weapon, but his hand shook uncontrollably, the revolver wavering in the air like a branch in a storm. Frank tried to reach the door, made it 3 steps before his legs buckled beneath him. He crashed into a table, scattering cards and coins across the sawdust floor. Wade finally got his Colt free from the holster, rage and terror contorting his features as he raised it toward Samantha. His aim drifted wildly, hand trembling, finger fumbling for the trigger. The gun discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet splintering floorboards near Clayton's table. But no one moved to help the Daltons. The saloon's patrons had pressed themselves against the walls, witnesses to justice that would never be spoken of. "You poisoned us," Wade managed, the accusation barely coherent. "I did," Samantha confirmed. "Men like you have ridden through towns like this for too long, taking what you want, killing who you please, facing no consequences. Tonight, that ends." Tommy was crying now, tears streaming down his young face as paralysis crept through his body. Carl attempted to crawl toward the exit, determination burning in his eyes despite the numbness spreading through his limbs. He made it 5 feet before collapsing completely, face down in the sawdust. Frank, even dying, managed to speak through gritted teeth. "You'll hang for this."
"Maybe," Samantha acknowledged quietly, "but you'll be dead first. That's enough." Wade made one final attempt to raise his weapon, but the Colt slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering across the floor. It spun slowly before coming to rest, pointing toward the door. Through the window, Samantha could see their horses tied to the hitching post, still saddled, waiting for riders who would never return. Wade Dalton hit the floor with the sound of dead weight, his breathing shallow and irregular, his eyes rolling back as the poison completed its work. Carl lay motionless where he'd fallen, only his chest moving in labored, weakening gasps. Tommy had slumped against the bar, sliding down to sit on the floor, his young face frozen in an expression of terrified incomprehension. Frank's breathing stopped first, then Tommy's, then Carl's. Wade lasted longest, his scarred hand twitching once, twice, then finally going still. 4 men had entered the Golden Ace that night. 4 bodies would be discovered at dawn. This widow's vengeance is far from over. Subscribe now. The next chapter brings a confrontation that will test everything Samantha has built.
Samantha moved methodically, first collecting their weapons, 4 Colts, 3 knives, 2 rifles. She placed them in a canvas sack beneath the bar. The weapons would be sold through intermediaries in Lincoln, the gun belts buried separately along unmarked stretches of the Platte River. Nothing could connect these men to her establishment. Clayton Brooks finally stood, his weathered face showing neither approval nor condemnation. "I'll fetch Doc Sullivan and Howard Finch," he said quietly. This was his role in Samantha's justice. Clayton would report finding 4 men collapsed on the North Trail, apparently victims of bad whiskey or tainted food from some other establishment. The other patrons began filing out quietly, understanding that what they'd witnessed would never be spoken of. In the morning, they'd express shock about the tragic discovery of the notorious Dalton brothers. Some might even speculate about divine justice finally catching up to train robbers. Within the hour, Howard Finch's wagon arrived. The cadaverous undertakers supervised the loading with professional efficiency, his assistant covering the bodies with a stained canvas tarp. "Found him on the North Trail," Howard announced to no one in particular, establishing the official narrative. "Looks like heart failure, maybe poison mushrooms. You know how these drifters eat anything when they're hungry." Samantha handed him an envelope containing his standard fee plus extra for discretion. Their transaction was wordless, conducted with the understanding of people who'd cooperated many times before. As the wagon pulled away, Deputy Marshal George Kinsley appeared across the street, watching. He was young for a lawman, barely 29, with the kind of idealism that hadn't yet been beaten out of him by frontier realities. He'd been asking questions lately, noticing patterns that others deliberately overlooked. Kinsley crossed the dusty street with measured steps, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Evening, Mrs. Jackson," he said formally, tipping his hat. His eyes scanned the saloon's interior, noting the overturned table, the wet floorboards where Samantha had mopped, the faint smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air. "Heard there was some commotion here tonight." 4 drifters came through," Samantha replied calmly. "They'd been drinking before they arrived, seemed poorly. They left after 1 drink, said they needed air." She met his gaze without flinching. "Terrible thing, hearing they died on the trail. But men who live rough often die rough." Kinsley studied her face, searching for tells that a less experienced liar might have shown.
That's the 17th incident in 3 years involving men who stopped at your establishment before dying mysteriously, Kinsley said, his voice carefully controlled. "Some folks might find that coincidental." "Some folks might," Samantha agreed. "But Silver Ridge attracts a rough element, Deputy Marshal. Always has. Men who live violently tend to die suddenly. That's not coincidence. That's just the natural order of things on the frontier."
Kinsley's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue with the logic. The men who died after visiting the Golden Ace were all wanted criminals, men with prices on their heads and blood on their hands. If someone was systematically removing them, was that murder or pest control? The question troubled him in ways his legal training hadn't prepared him for. The law doesn't recognize natural order as justification for killing, Kinsley said, though his voice lacked conviction. He'd been deputy marshal for only 9 months, appointed after his predecessor was killed trying to arrest rustlers. Samantha leaned against the bar, her expression softening slightly. "Tell me something, deputy. When those train robbers killed my husband, did the law deliver justice? When the Dalton brothers murdered people across 3 states, did the law stop them?" She paused, letting the questions hang heavy in the air. "The law is a luxury of civilized places. Out here, we have something else. Call it Nebraska pragmatism." "If everyone took justice into their own hands, we'd have chaos," Kinsley argued, but he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "The law might be slow, but it's what separates us from animals." "Sheriff, the law is only as good as the men who enforce it and the speed with which it arrives." Kinsley's voice carried the weight of personal loss. "By the time your warrants are processed and your posses assembled, how many more innocents are dead? I didn't choose this role. It chose me the day Roland died and his killers rode free." Kinsley removed his hat, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "I can't prove anything, but I'm watching, Mrs. Jackson. Eventually, you'll make a mistake. Then the question is whether you'll be there to see it, or whether you'll have learned what this territory really needs by then." 3 months passed. Winter settled over Silver Ridge with brutal efficiency, and with it came a complication that would test everything Samantha had built.
The woman who entered the Golden Ace on that February morning wore expensive clothes that marked her as someone of means. Rebecca Winters, perhaps 42, handsome rather than pretty, with the kind of determined expression that Samantha recognized in her own mirror. "You're Samantha Jackson," Rebecca said, not as a question. "I've traveled from Omaha because I've heard stories about a saloon where bad men come to drink and never leave." She paused, studying Samantha's reaction. "I need your help. There's a man named Vincent Hayes, a railroad baron who murdered my husband and bought his way out of prosecution. He's too powerful for the law to touch, but I'm told you have other methods." Rebecca placed a leather pouch on the bar, coins clinking heavily inside. $800, my entire life savings. All I'm asking is that Vincent Hayes drinks at your establishment and receives the hospitality he deserves. Samantha's first instinct was denial. "What you're suggesting is murder. I run a respectable saloon." "Your husband was Roland Jackson, railroad detective, killed 3 years ago," Rebecca recited, clearly having done research. "Since his death, 17 wanted criminals have died in or near Silver Ridge, all of them after visiting your establishment. The coincidence is remarkable, don't you think?" Rebecca's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her weathered face. "My husband owned farmland Hayes wanted for the railroad expansion. Hayes had him killed, made it look like an accident. 6 witnesses were intimidated or bribed. The judge owned stock in Hayes's company." She slammed her hand on the bar. "I'm not leaving until you agree to help me." Samantha took 3 days to decide. 3 days of weighing her carefully constructed security against the moral imperative of stopping a man like Hayes. In the end, it was the memory of Roland that decided her. They met in the cellar laboratory, 2 widows bound by railroad violence. "Hayes attends an investors' dinner in Lincoln next month. I've arranged for you to work as temporary staff at the Continental Hotel." Samantha held up a small vial of clear liquid. "Tasteless, odorless, works within 20 minutes, but once we start, there's no turning back." "Then we'd better not fail, Mrs. Jackson." Samantha packed her special brandy decanter, knowing Vincent Hayes would either be her greatest triumph or her final mistake.
Justice doesn't wait for the law. Subscribe now to see how Samantha's deadliest mission unfolds in Lincoln. One wrong move and everything ends.
If you enjoyed this latest story on life in the Old Wild West, then I'm sure you will love the next one coming up. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you can get updates on time. Did I tell you we post new, exciting, heartwarming stories daily? Subscribe now to join us so you won't miss any new stories.